You're listening to the Karmic Mirror podcast, where we explore the wisdom tucked within the layers of the self-help world.
Together, we bridge the gap between esoteric teachings and practical tools for everyday life, with self-love and personal growth at the heart of each conversation.
Whether you're a seasoned seeker or just beginning your path, join us and uncover the magic within and around you.
Welcome back to another episode of Karmic Mirror. Hello, Michelle.
Hello, everyone.
Today's episode focuses on the wounded healer, also known as Chiron. And so in today's episode, we're really going to dive deeper into Chiron, how it impacts all of us, and how it impacts the collective and how it influences our personal wounds. Before we start diving a little bit deeper, I would strongly encourage everyone to go to Channing Nichols, to Cafe Astrology, pull up your own personal natal chart, look for the key symbol, and that is your Chiron placement. It'll be super helpful as we begin to have this conversation, just to keep that in mind. And we'll get more into the significance of the key in just a little bit. So I think about 3 years ago, Michelle, you had brought Chiron up to me, and we're just really, really excited about it. And I think when we were coming up with topics that we knew we would eventually record, you had felt so lit up about this topic that you put together an outline, and here we are recording today. So talk to us a little bit about why specifically, when in all of the areas of astrology that we could dive deeper into, what about Chiron lights you up so much?
So, one, we talked a lot about kind of the foundational aspects of your natal chart in our astrology primer episode. So definitely give that a listen if you haven't. But in addition to those aspects of like your sun, your moon, your rising, I find Chiron to be one of the most impactful and almost like I would never say a shortcut because it's certainly not that, but like this ability to locate the area of your life, the ways in which you have experienced a lot of wounding in your life. And so it's such an important point. We had an episode on the North and South Node, and these like are for me, Sun, Moon, and Rising, the North and South Node, and Chiron have been kind of recurring themes in my life of, you know, and especially the nodes and Chiron of places that I've constantly really dug into over the years and found, like any type of self-discovery work, deeper layers of understanding as I evolve over time. And with Chiron, it was just such a beautiful lesson in being able to look at so many of the experiences in my life that maybe were more painful and tender, and look at them with much more understanding, acceptance. And that's what Chiron's all about, the wounded healer. So,
I heard it as referenced as the sensitive button in your chart. Not in a
ooh.
good or bad way, but I liked that. So what I love, the more we dive into astrology, the more I am starting to hear more about the mythology behind
Mhm.
astrology. And that really geeks me out because I just love, the fantasy of Greek gods and mythology and that, but it also helps me understand more about my natal chart. So walk us through, because the Chiron background is a really cool story and you tell it really beautifully. So tell us about the
Hmm.
mythology of Chiron.
Okay, so yes, I love the archetypes of mythology that are so interwoven through astrology. And you're right, it really does help us better understand these themes. And Chiron is a really fascinating story because I think it really illustrates Greek mythology as having so much, I don't know, really sad themes along with just everyday life. It's really interesting to look back on. So Chiron is born, he was born from the Titan Cronus. And so from his very beginnings of his origin story, Chiron was really born out of deception. His father was a Titan who transformed himself into a horse to get away from his wife. And he mated with a nymph, Valeria, and from the nymph and the Titan came Chiron. And he was born as half man, half horse, a centaur. And his mom, the nymph, was so horrified that she abandoned him. So not only was he born from deception, but then immediately upon his birth, his own mother abandoned him. And there starts his story of just sad suffering. And the good news of this story early on, there's many highs and lows to a story like any person, but is that he gets adopted by the god Apollo, who is known as the god of the arts, of science, the arts, music, all of these beautiful things. And so, as a result of this, Chiron becomes this teacher, and he becomes a mentor, and he's really renowned as a teacher of arts, healing, prophecy, and he mentored all of these great Greek heroes that we know about, like Achilles, like Heracles. And so the reason why he earns this title of the wounded healer is that in addition to his already kind of tragic origin story, is that in training, he gets accidentally hit by a poisoned arrow by Heracles, who he's mentoring. And even though Chiron is immortal, he continues to suffer because this wound, because of the poison blood that it's dipped in, it's
Mhm.
it's this incurable wound. So the mentor is in this immortal suffering. And so, in his quest for relief from this suffering and pain, he sacrifices his immortality for Prometheus, and the god Zeus then honors Chiron as a constellation Centaurus, which we know to be Chiron. And so throughout his story is weaved these themes of wounding and suffering, and then transmuting that story into then teaching and mentoring and healing, and then more suffering.
Mhm.
And then sacrifice, and having to really transform all of this pain and suffering into something that can be used for the good of the collective.
Yes. I love this story. And I'm chomping at the bit to share some other little nuggets,
Yes.
gold nuggets that we've heard along the way or I've heard in researching. But I love the way you tell the story all the way through. So I really appreciate you walking us through the journey. And the one piece that we had talked about previously when talking about Chiron was that I read Kronos, who's Chiron's father, who
Mhm.
turned himself into a horse to be, be a big fat adulterer. Um, he is representative of Saturn, and
Yeah.
Apollo is the sun god. So the theme that often comes up for you and I also comes up with Chiron of that duality. So it's almost like you turn that grumpy wisdom into a tool to help others and be a
Mhm.
light in others' worlds, which I think also is a deeper layer of that story of Chiron, of how you go into the deep, right? You go into the deep and the dark,
Yeah.
maybe the like the hard, the bad. There's so many adjectives, but it ultimately becomes the light. And so he's not usually the main character of stories, is what I
Mhm.
heard about. It's you have to think of his influence. And that's where I kind of think about it in astrology as well. I think I had brought up the other day where we often talk about the sun, the moon sign, the rising sign in your chart.
Mhm.
But my guess would be is that in your work with Chiron, you've seen how this Chiron placement directly impacts the rest of your natal chart, right? To some
Yeah.
degree. And So that's kind of what you think about Chiron. So, one of his famous students was Achilles, who was a great warrior, who was the hero of the Trojan War. So Chiron taught him, he was his mentor.
Yeah.
So I just really love this whole story. And then that they also back to, I just thought it was interesting. Kronos, is representative or represents Saturn. And now they're finding that they think Chiron might have rings also, which I just think is really interesting because they only really discovered Chiron in 1977. Is that accurate? Something. It's newer, right?
Yeah, well, I think that originally it was thought to be a comet, I
Hmm.
think. Don't quote me on that. But now it's classified as like a minor planet or a comet. But interestingly enough, the themes of duality are really kind of interlaced throughout all of this story and also through so much of our natal chart, the north and south nodes, it's polarity. And so I think back to Chiron's story, it's like this learning the wisdom or cultivating the wisdom through our wounding, through our suffering, to be able to hold all of it. It's like we talk about the healing journey. It's not about healing, isn't about eliminating the pain and suffering. It's about expanding your capacity to have the joy, the beauty of life, the gratitude, and also acknowledge the suffering and what came from it. And that's so true to the story. There's all of it that we get to hold. So I think that leads to even more of the symbolism. I mean, the wounded healer, to me, it's like if that's all you said, it almost, to me, it always clicks in that way, the wounded healer or the key, because that's it. Well, first of all, I wrote that blog last week about, or it was my newsletter, I think, and it was about just the beginning. I was talking about this book that I'm reading, and it's the last book, Kingdom of Ash, in the Sarah J. Maas series, Throne of Glass. And the main character is one of my favorite female lead characters of any fantasy series that I've read. But her story really takes you through all of these books, through all of the shame and the grief and the guilt that she carries throughout every single book in different ways, and how it shows up in her relationships with and in the ways that she, advocates for herself or for her people. I mean, she's half human, half fae,
Half what?
but half human, half fae. So, anyways, but basically, what I was getting at is that there's this thing of like throughout the stories of her tunneling deeper into her power, right? And this is a common theme in these fantasy stories. So if you know, you know, and if you don't, it's okay. Not everybody has to get addicted to these books, but it's through looking at your pain, at your grief, at your suffering, at your shame, at your guilt, and all of these things, and starting to remove the judgment and starting to accept it for just part of your story, and also accept that it's not the only part of your story. It's not your whole, it's not all of you. There's more to you. And it's through that journey of like digging deep into your wounding that we get to really be in touch with our own power. And I think that's such a cool thing because we talk about the wounded healer. We're wounded. And if we can look at that and we can start to heal and grow, it transforms. It's like it alchemizes into these beautiful healing gifts for yourself, for the people in your life, for the collective, whatever, right? Like that part isn't necessarily maybe even our business to know who we're impacting. It's just trusting that the more you can lean into those things and see them for what they are instead of letting them be your whole story. It's just a really, really beautiful, beautiful uh, reality.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Rumi quote, the wounds let the light in. Kind of
Mm,
that's what I'm picturing
yeah.
too, when you talk
Um,
about Chiron.
you just made me think of EFT, of EFT tapping, because when we talk about EFT tapping, right, you're tapping on those acupressure points, and it's like giving those wounds, those emotional wounds, opening them up, letting them breathe so that we can start to do the healing work and then transform, right? And it's like also the other thought that sparked up was when you hear people say so often, like, I could experience that immense level of gratitude and joy because I understood the suffering and I understood how the depth of my sorrow. And I think there's so much beauty and so much truth in all of that. And they all are so like we're saying the same thing in so many different ways, but it's so true and it's all Chiron. So the key, the symbol, I think that also points to. Was there anything else about that before I talk about the key? Okay, cool. Because talking about symbolism, right? The wounded healer, and if you're following along in your natal chart, you're going to find Chiron by looking for the key. It is literally that. And that was what clicked in my mind. I'm both visual, I'm both, I need a little bit of different approaches for learning to really settle in for me. And the key was something that helped me click right away because I was like, oh, okay. It's the symbol of the key because it is the key to unlocking your healing journey. And I was like, I get it. I get it. I mean, I get it. And then, of course, years later, it's like I keep getting it in different ways and it keeps deepening the understanding. But that part really stood out to me. And so, Chiron's story, whether it's through the mythology or whether it's drawing parallels to your own experiences, it just illustrates how much our personal suffering and wounding, when tended to and not ignored, when really looked at without judgment and with acceptance, can lead to this deeper understanding of ourselves, of our others, of others, of our own healing, to deeper empathy and compassion and all of the things that can lead to.
I was listening to Past Lives and the Divine this morning in preparation for our podcast right now. And I think before we start diving into the houses and write the signs, one thing that they called out in this podcast that I also thought was really important to call out, because in researching Chiron, I have been looking at my placements and been getting a little ho hum. And right, there could be more to it, energetics, but I've been feeling like a little womp womp of, oh my gosh, this is heavy, this is hard, all the things. And
Hmm.
before they started getting into the specifics of placements and that, one of the women on the podcast said, like, I think it's really important that you don't have to project this onto your future. You don't have to project these things, right? And all things in astrology, and you might sum it up a little bit more concise, but a friendly reminder that we have all components of all of the signs and all of the things in
Yeah.
all of our charts. They just look different and they show up differently. And so I thought it was important to bring that up in our episode, because when she said that, I thought, oh my gosh, I have been doing that since we've been, like, well, one, it makes sense, but two,
Hmm.
which there's always that aha, like, oh, this becomes really clear. But then two, I've just felt so weighed down with like the burden of this. So I'm going
Yeah.
to hand it off to you and take this, elaborate a little bit more on what I said, and then certainly help us navigate or transition into the houses.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. But I do think that what you're saying, it's like when we talk about human design or we talk about any of these systems, right? The point is the second it starts to feel restrictive is like the moment to be like, okay, hold on, I need to take a step back because the whole point of all of this is to empower you in your own free will, in your own sense of like autonomy, and not to make you feel. And once we do, for me anyways, and I don't know if this lands for you, but I feel like the second I start to judge my anything about my self or the way I'm thinking, I'm like, oh, okay, that's either like ego chalk or that's misalignment. And it's just a reminder, or it's conditioning. It's all, I'm saying all the same thing in different interpretations. But, and I think that's one really freaking cool to be at a place where we can hear those thoughts or recognize it and be like, oh, okay,
Mhm.
I hear it. I hear you. I hear what you're saying. Inner critic, inner component, whatever we're calling the thing, inner mean girl, all of the
Yeah,
names.
I wish I was a little. No, everything is divinely timed. It
Yeah, well,
it
that's
wasn't as quick for me on this one, but when you're saying that, now what's coming up for me is that so I listened to two separate podcasts, and on both of them, what's interesting now in hindsight is that there are a couple of the houses, not the same in each of the episodes, but that the host slash hosts highlighted in some way of like having more sympathy for people in that area, or this
mm,
might be a little bit harder. And so that definitely hit that trigger for me that is the thing that I've always felt like it has to be really, really bad to receive help. And that obviously is kind of going into my wound, maybe. And when we get into the Chiron and the houses makes sense. But I was even listening and I was like, okay, well, I shouldn't feel this low because they said like the fourth house, that's really tough when that's in Chiron, right? So it's
mm,
just a mind fuck a little bit, but fun to talk about because we get to
yeah,
recognize, even if it's real time here, be reminded that oftentimes those are your inner opponents.
exactly. And yeah, it really should be like, or shoulda, woulda, coulda, but like really something that empowers you to just like know yourself and trust yourself more than the voices. And it's the muscle that we build every single time. And it's the people in our lives who reflect it back to us and vice versa that help us strengthen those muscles, which is like, if you're listening in, if you're part of these conversations, then, you're in the right place because that's what we're here to do is just like keep mirroring back and being like, okay, like, it's okay. Well, I love the sensitive button that you said at the top of the
Mhm.
episode because I was saying like tenderness, it's these tender spots, but it's true, like where we're most tender. And if we have the right environments around us and the right people and the right tools, and we're giving ourselves the tools, you can start to feel the tenderness, feel the sensitive being pushed up against and not run from it.
Just friendly reminders. We're all about self-love and giving ourselves grace. So just let's listen moving
Hmm.
forward, giving ourselves grace, just not to project anything onto our future, just to get really interested. And so
Yeah.
grab your charts and good time now, Michelle, to start talking about how Chiron impacts
Yeah,
signs and the house, etc.
for sure. One last thing I'll say. It's never the last thing. But you talked about duality, and this fun fact about Chiron is that it is technically classified as both a minor planet and a comet. And I bring this up because of the duality. So this sort of positions Chiron at the intersection of healing and transformation because healing, the wounded healer identity, and the transformative qualities of comets. So comets are moving fast through the sky, right? By the time we see them, they're like thousands and thousands of years old. So, um, if you think about our personal challenges, our growth, and our healing journey, there's the duality always of both. Um, and the other thing that came up just now is we talked about the Titan Cronus, and I think Cronus translates to time, right? Like Saturn is all about, time, schedules, things like that. And so it's funny if you think about it's funny, but it's not funny. It depends on what point you are on your healing journey. If it's a moment where it's funny or really infuriating, we don't
Mhm.
know. It comes in waves.
Yeah.
But the time, the schedule of like, it always brings me back like there is no definitive time of your healing journey. There's no, it's your, like you said, it's divine timing and only you can be the one to navigate that, you're the only one walking that journey, right? And it's like, so there is no expectation. It's a really beautiful thing to look at that. So let's talk about the significance in your natal chart. So if you have your chart out, you're going to see that the key symbol Chiron, it's going to have two aspects. You have the sign that it's in, and you have the house that it's in. And like our astrology primer episode, we talk about how the sign really expresses the style. So if you're talking about Chiron, it's the style in which or the ways in which Chiron or perhaps this Chiron wound is going to be expressed or experienced in our life. Whereas if you look to the house number 1 through 12, this is going to reveal the area of your life where that healing journey really plays out. And so both are really important, right? It really depends on, yeah, what you're looking for. I find it's helpful to know both because it gives you the fuller story. But if you're looking exclusively at the house number, you can start to narrow in on the area of your life that this is playing out in, and then maybe draw some parallels to your own experiences around this. So we're going to go through a couple examples. Well, we'll talk about ours because I think that's helpful. And then we'll go through the houses so we can start to just get a little clearer on the areas of our lives. So for me, my Chiron is in Gemini in my fifth house of creative expression, of pleasure, of children. And so it kind of points to, Gemini is the Gemini is very curious. Gemini is very talkative. And if we think about people we know in our lives who are Geminis and we think, oh my gosh, this person can talk all day, I'm not a Gemini and I can talk all day too, and vice versa. But we tend to associate that really curious, like very talkative, very social aspects with Gemini. And so the way that this shows up for me is a lot around self-expression and creativity. And for me, when I think about Gemini as a sign, a lot of it is that naturally for me, I tend to have this ability to hold opposing ideas, hold various multiple beliefs, and have the space for those things without maybe being so hardwired to side with one thing or to really believe one thing. But where I think I find um, challenges is in being able to express that because there's a lot of fear around it. Because so often, I think I told you, I mean, we were talking about this before we hit record, which why we didn't hit record earlier, I don't know. Um, lessons,
Yeah.
but about how I really grew up with a parent that just, really took a lot of the air out of every room. And as a result, like I grew up wanting to really either censor myself or I had to be, I would say there's multiple layers. There's the one of that being, having a parent that does have a lot of narcissistic tendencies, and I won't like label, I'm not qualified to do so, but that really soaked up every last bit of air. If you've ever met my dad, you know. And yeah, and you'd pick up on it right away. And there was that. There were the duality, this Gemini duality of having to present this version of myself to people for social acceptance for all of the things. And then there was this inner life that at home that I really had to hide. And I had to have this duality of my life and show up and express myself, but I had to be incredibly cautious about what I could say. And so I grew up censoring a lot of what I said. I grew up with people being like, you're so quiet, you're so shy, speak up, speak up. And, I told you this earlier. It's like in my heart of hearts, was like, I'm not a shy person and I'm not that quiet, but I have a person in my life who you know, is constantly telling me what I need to say or what I can't say, or showing me what's not acceptable in our private lives and all of these things. And as a result, without going so deep into it, this has been my deepest like healing journey that has peeled back layer after layer. And it's not like any journey, it's not constant, but it's like every few years or every few seasons, something comes around to poke a little bit more at that little sensitive button and be like, oh, there's a little bit more there. There's more. You're growing, you're evolving into more of yourself. You're becoming fuller and more stepping into your light. And now like there's more. Are you sure you feel safe enough to do that? Are you sure that you're ready to do that? It's the ego, it's our protection mode. And so does that make sense? That's how I interpret it.
Yeah,
That's how it shows up a lot for me.
yeah. And I think what's interesting is just to call out again in the spirit of the uniqueness of people's charts and
Hmm.
when considering your fifth house, for me, I think like if someone were to ask me, like, does Michelle self-express herself? Does she, I'd be like, yeah, she's one of the most confident people
Yeah.
I know. And, and I could just go on and on and on for days like that. And this is not about how other people see you. It's about understanding and getting interested, right? Because when you share that story with me, of course, like click, it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But self-expression, there is so much subjectivity to that it can just look so different. And
Yeah.
I think it's really cool because again, you've been focusing on Chiron for some time, right? It doesn't mean that it's things don't show up or right, don't present themselves to you, but still finding new ways that it's presenting
Yeah.
itself and walking through those thoughts and feelings and emotions.
Well, also, what's wild is to think about the people I work with now. We work on these themes. And so, talk about the wounded healer and really transforming like, what are your healing gifts? Well, I am exceptionally skilled and gifted at holding space for deep, dark, and for joy and for all of these things. And so, when I work with people, usually these themes are what's coming up. How do I show up authentically? How do I express myself confidently? How do I express myself assertively, get my point across? And still and come from a place of self-worth and value. And so it's cool to see how it starts to shift. You're like, oh yeah, this was something I'm this is my continued healing journey. And as I continue to heal my own wounding, I can, if I so choose, but I also can help others heal in similar themes. And that's what shows up, right? Because we start to draw these people to us. So the people who come to me for coaching, I'm like, oh, I see it. I see it because we, and I have this unique ability from my personal lived experience to be able to hold that space a little differently because, and that's why you were drawn to me, to coach or whatever it is, or just in conversation. And and I think that's really cool. Something I'll just drop before we talk about yours is that in the in the Channy app, when you look at your Chiron, part of what mine is in Gemini in the fifth house is she talks about expressing unapologetic pleasure and joy and sharing that. And that's so much of my journey too, is like loosening this guilt of like, is it okay to be joyful and grateful and live and really like soak up this joy of being in this lifetime despite all of the shitty things that occur on a daily basis in or out of my life, and loosen up on that guilt of being able to share that with others because you feel like, oh, how dare I be happy? How dare I be so grateful when there's suffering and there's this? And it's like, no, because I have experienced deep suffering too, and not there's no hierarchy, but I'm allowed to have joy and I'm allowed to help others tap into that and still not bypass, not ignore, but like be with their own wounds and their own healing journey and still experience deep, deep joy, unapologetically experience pleasure in the little things, in the big things. So, anyways, those are all my personal revelations over the years. Not all of them,
Thank
but
you.
some of them. So let's talk about yours, Chiron.
My Chiron is in Taurus in the ninth house. So I learned in the last couple of days a little bit more about this.
Yeah.
Very 3-5. Shout out to our human design 2-hour episode if you want to know what lit up generators sounds like or you're interested in human design. Go listen to that. And so maybe the 3-5 or look at profiles might make more sense. But I think the more time I have had to process and listen to different points of view on Taurus in the ninth house. Well, let's get into it. I would ask you just Taurus, if you could give me like 4 words that describe Taurus. I just think you're better at it than I am. What would be like
Do
the
you?
characteristics of Taurus? I do think whether that's true or not, but like how would you explain Tauruses? I'm just not as familiar.
Yeah. Well, I think this is really helpful though, actually, because, I've talked about Gemini in the fifth house, but what we're really saying is like, yes, Gemini, curious, talkative, social in the fifth house of creativity, self-expression, pleasure, children. It's like we start to link those things together. And so Taurus, in the style of Taurus, or how it's expressed, well, okay, Taurus ruled by the planet Venus, which Venus is, Venus rules Libra and Taurus. And if you think of
Luxury,
Libra,
treat yourself.
luxury, yeah,
Mhm.
material comforts. And so if Venus rules both Libra and Taurus, and Venus is the planet of relationships and love and harmony and all of those beautiful Venusian themes and concepts. It's like Libra is this like heavenly quality of air sign of Venus qualities, whereas Taurus is the grounded earth sign. And so we associate Taurus a lot with the material world because it is a lot associated with creature comforts. And we say words like luxury because Taurus, I mean, I have my moon in Taurus, and for me, it always translates to I need this like beauty in my surroundings, and it makes me feel really good and at home and secure in my spaces, in my environment. So I think of Taurus in that way, but Taurus is also the bull. So um, I associate words like integrity and resilience and um, what is that word I'm thinking of? Perseverance. And
Mhm.
like those words I always associate with
Yeah.
Taurus, because Taurus can really transmute, the hard work. I won't say hard work, but the resilience, maybe the perseverance it takes in order to manifest these material creature comforts in this earthly plane. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah, it does. So when it goes to the way when I was trying to connect with how it might show up. So it's almost when I look at the signs, it's almost like you're going to see how that my interpretation and keep me honest here is that's where I'll find more challenges when it's in Chiron because for example, it's like the sign of treat yourself. So it said early home life may
Mm,
have been erratic and impacted the way stability is viewed as an adult. You may never feel secure or like you have enough. Constant fear of loss, poverty, or not having enough to survive. Your mode of healing is creating a stable life for yourself while also learning to rely on others. And so, as you know, like the big bang of my life, I think, and that's maybe why when we were discussing the other day of like, do we want to talk about sign? Do we want to talk about houses? I think the
yeah,
Taurus just resonates with me so much because
sure.
of what has happened the last couple
Yeah,
of years. And so, on that note, I would just say, you can simply, we're not going through the signs. We just want to give you examples of how you can marry the two together. For
yeah.
Michelle and my examples, but really simply, you could Google, like, what does it mean if, or go to, Channy Nichols, we have all the resources for you. But often, too, they can put the entire workload on their back because they just don't trust that others will come through for them. And so then if you put that in the ninth house,
Hmm.
so ninth house is your beliefs, higher education, travel, and spiritual exploration.
Yeah. Could also be publishing, philosophy,
So it'd be interesting
that
to get
realm.
your thoughts on the ninth house, maybe how you see it come up for me, because you're great at doing that. I think a couple examples that I connected real life is that earlier in the podcast they were talking about how Chiron to them is your karma, right? Like your karmic wounds that you're bringing in, and so also it could impact its impact from your past lives. And so if you also look at that constant fear, loss, poverty, like that runs in my family, I can very much
Yeah.
understand, like given my background and my family's heritage, why that would continue to be a wound for me ancestrally. And then they were talking about, and this might seem a little bit minor, but travel is also in the ninth house. And so they said these people could have, and this could show up in many different ways, but extreme fears of flying. When I
Hmm.
was in like my late 20s, just out of nowhere, I just started getting this extreme fear of flying. And so much so, I started taking Xanax to fly. I mean, I was traveling so
Yeah.
much. And they were talking a little bit because the wound could present if you're literally afraid to go travel and do the things, and that the counteracting, isn't it so interesting that you know me as someone who has traveled a lot? Like I know I haven't
Mm,
needed medication to fly in a very long time. I feel like that
yeah.
wound of travel, I've kind of, when I was
Hmm.
younger, there was more fear around going different places and doing new things, but
Yeah.
that's just an example for me where I see and if you think about like the travel component with Taurus, it's the money, it's the where you're staying, it's like feeling
Totally.
comfortable and safe in your travels. And that I think is what is starting why I'm starting to light up right now and talk a lot about it, because houses are not always so straightforward where there's one area, so
Right.
you can start to connect it to a lot of different areas. Does anything jump out for you about me of what you just know about me or
Yeah, well, I guess the one thing that maybe comes up, and I don't know if it even lands, but I also wonder if any aspect of that material security and that safety, that like of, stability, Taurus, um, I think about our conversations around themes of being seen, and I guess what I'm getting at is like I've seen it play out where, one, we can refer back to the VCon episode and talk about the travel experience that brought up experiences that had nothing to do with the actual travel itself, but it had everything to do with those underlying fears, and that took you out of stability and feeling safe and secure, and there's the money related to the travel, right? Like, but if we think about the healing journey, it's like every time, every step forward sets you free, right? Like every time you did the thing, it got, the fear or your capacity to hold the fear and the wounding grew a little bit more with every experience. And, I think about if we're looking at ninth house publishing, astrology, philosophy, education, right? Like how much of your stories about around material stability and security and I'll say like home and belonging, because I think those are all very Taurus as well.
Mhm.
Um, can sometimes like show up when you're doing things like, like starting a podcast, like writing a blog, like showing up like, oh, what services am I going to put out into the world? How am I going to educate others? How am I going to share my own expertise? How am I going to publish things like we're talking about here, or articulate my beliefs around philosophy and astrology and all of these things? And how do I do it in a way that I don't have to necessarily tie it directly to my money story or stability? I can let it be these things that, um, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, imposter syndrome comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And yeah, of course. And I think I could come up with a zillion different examples, but let's jump into the other example
Yeah.
because we're going to just talk through one more example of a sign and a house that it's in, and then we really are going
Yeah.
to get into the houses and talk a little bit more. So that's a good intro to the ninth house and kind of seeing with Taurus. Let's shed some light on the next example that you were going to talk a little bit more about was Leo in the fourth house.
Yeah, just to provide some more context. I mean, we could talk about ourselves all day because we're obviously like, as we talk about it, more stuff comes up. We're like, oh, yeah, I can see that. I see the connecting dots because everything is connected.
Mhm.
And so, if your Chiron is in Leo in the fourth house of home and foundations, this might show up as wounding around self-worth and identity, which are very Leo-driven themes. And it may show up and it can stem from your early family dynamics, your home, your environment. So I guess the reason why we want to highlight another example is just purely so that as you hear the houses, you can start to look at, okay, if my Chiron lands in my fourth house of home, foundations, upbringing, and Leo is in my fourth house in Chiron, it's Leo in the fourth house. I'm saying it all jumbled, but what are the qualities of Leo? How does that wound express itself? Where is it showing up in my life? And then again, like it's all about starting to draw those parallels to your own life experiences, because that's how we deepen the understanding and self-discovery. We're like, oh, I see how that showed up in this time in my life. And then I see how it showed up again in another totally different area. It's like when you start to work on your money story and your money issues or your blocks, and you start to heal those things, then you're like, oh, now it's showing up in my relationships and here, because it's everything is so connected. So it gives you a little bit of like like a little mathematical equation of like, if my Chiron is in this sign, in this house, what are the qualities of the sign? Where is this house number in my, what area of life is it? And then start to connect the dots for yourself. So it's
Yeah.
really cool. So
And not always, but it does get to the point, at least for me, where sometimes I can giggle about shit that comes up because I'm just like, yep, makes sense, you know.
oh
And
yeah.
that's another benefit of kind of learning more about this stuff, right? Again, it's reframing, where I had a little bit of a ho-hum about, am I ever going to
Hmm.
get rid of XYZ in my wounds, but then not projecting it onto your future. So it almost becomes this little game with your inner opponent of, ah, ha, ha, I see you. Not that it always makes
Yeah.
it easy, but
No, but and also you and I totally relate a lot on just humor and laughter. As like for me, I need almost every aspect of my life served with a side of humor and laughter, because it brings a lot of levity. It brings me back to presence in a lot of ways, because when you're stuck in a spiral or a mode of like, I can't see through the fog, sometimes we do need to laugh at ourselves a little bit if we can, depending on the situation, right? There's like only you can decide. And it's almost like this little, like it shakes you a little bit because you're like, oh, okay, hold on. Yes, I'm in the depths of my absolute, terror and all the things. And also, there's more. Like, what else is there? I mean, sometimes the laughter is just purely a physical, uncontrolled response from our body,
yeah.
but we need that. Like, a part of me is like, is it just my body responding to shake me out of this fear mode so that I can see what else is actually going on? I can expand my own view of the situation. And so, anyways, so let's get to the houses. So we'll go through them quickly because I love going through the houses. It helps me remember them. So your first house is your house of your identity, self-image, and your personal approach to life. That's the first house. That's why our rising sign is always in the first house. And so you can imagine if Chiron lands in your first house, this is going to perhaps show up in areas associated with how you view yourself.
A wound attached to like identity and also how this might look, just add a little bit of color to some things that I've heard is that your identity might be wrapped up in other things, and
Mm,
that's how it might show up for you. I mean, that's very high
yeah.
level. So then the second house,
Second house is money, finances, material possessions, and could also be self-worth, because we are in a world, a culture where unfortunately what you do for a living is so intertwined with how we view our worth. Although the more healing journey, you can start to separate the two. But the second house is your second house of money. And so if Chiron is there, it's a really great opportunity to look at your money origin stories. Where did your hardwired beliefs around resources, where are they stemming from? And is there anything in there that you could stand a deeper look? Third house of communication, siblings, your environment, your local community. Your fourth house of home, family. This is your foundation, your roots.
I heard about the fourth, just beautiful ways they were talking about it on past lives and the divine, was fourth house can be very mother wounds. So again, in this podcast, they were
Uh-huh.
talking about, it's your karmic and your past lives are indicative of, your soul's intention of raising your hand, knowing that your Chiron was going to be in this certain house, right?
Right.
Is it's kind of
Yeah.
the journey back here. And I just thought the reframe, it was really beautiful. And this was one of those examples where they kind of were giving a lot of empathy to those who like chose to have their Chiron in the fourth house because they said it's the mother wound. And that she sees a lot of her clients who are adopted with their Chiron in this house. And
Interesting.
that they also were giving it so much love because they were like, I love these people because it's almost they are the generational curse breakers. So it's like that family like
Wow.
stops with you. So I just thought that that was really cool to kind of call out. And that podcast just gave me a little bit. It was very interesting to me because they were also talking about, just for example, like in the second house, they were saying, you know, because your wounds are around money. In your past lives, you could have had a starvation wound. You could have had a traumatic death in your past life. So I might throw some of those in here that I thought really resonated with that as well.
For sure. Well, what brings up the fourth house when you're talking about the mother wound, I think I didn't read the book, but I'm familiar with it, is I think it's called Spirit Babies, and it talks about the different karmic relationships we have with our parents. And that's, part of the many layers as to why you may grow up in a home and have all the same experiences, but you and your siblings have totally different perspectives, totally different experiences in the same environment because we have different karmic relationships, and I think again, like, everything is connected. Everything is so interconnected. And, that doesn't mean that we have to go search for the meaning in everything. Like that sounds exhausting, but to be open to things that we can't fully understand because we're not, whether we're not meant to in the time frame or whatever it is. So where do we leave off? What were we at? Fifth house of creative self-expression, children. We talked a little bit about that and how that might show up. Something I think in the Chani app, she says that if your Chiron is in this play in the fifth house, you might do really well working with children, working with trauma and holding space because of it. So I thought that was really interesting. And also ties back to the pleasure, like that unapologetic pleasure and joy in the fifth house of self-expression. So sixth house, work, health, daily routines, service.
Yeah, they were talking about these might be people coming in with past OCD wounding, potentially
Mm.
like hypochondriacs. This is like your everyday struggles. But this was one they called out that they say you really are a healer, that you're a therapist. So they were saying it doesn't matter if you work at
Mm.
McDonald's, if you work in corporate America, if you are literally a therapist, you most likely, if this is your Chiron placement, you will find yourself in that
Mm.
role of being on a daily basis, kind of that therapist role was the way I jotted it down, which was interesting.
Yeah, maybe there's a lot of coaches out there who have this house Chiron in this house, maybe because oftentimes, when you go into coaching, one of the first things when you're getting to know everyone, they're like, okay, how many of you are the person that your friends and your family go to for, and everyone raises their hand. But I would imagine that there's a good amount of people who maybe have this placement too, or something else in their charts that points to
Yeah.
it. So, seventh house of committed partnerships, your relationships, how we relate to
Mhm.
others.
It was interesting. They talked about one of the hosts on here talked about, she said, the astrologer said, you can ask me any question. And she said, well, I hate to ask this question, but I just can't stop thinking about it. But like, am I doomed to, does this mean I will never be in a relationship or I have not, I will never be in a successful
Yeah.
relationship? And the way that I think to look about it is like she said, you probably had a lot of unsuccessful relationships in your past, but that's a wound, and that's what you're here to explore and dive into
Yeah.
here. So, no is the answer. You're not destined to be alone if your Chiron is
Yeah.
in the seventh house.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the free will conversation, right? Like we go into astrology, we go into human design, we go into these systems so that we can understand ourselves better, so that we can make better decisions and wield our own free will and autonomy in the best, most aligned ways for ourselves. And so I love that. And also, that's a big burden to carry, right? Like it goes back to the projecting onto your future, and it's not meant to be restrictive. So, eighth house of transformation, of shared resources, intimacy, and deeper psychological aspects of
They said
life.
that eighth house was of death, like a death
Oh yeah, I've
moving.
heard that
You've
too.
heard
Yeah,
that?
death. I mean, there's different I think different astrologers maybe use different language, and all are probably in some way. I mean,
Mhm.
right or whatever, or land, depending on who's the receiver. But yeah, I've heard death before as well.
Karmically, these would be people in past lives who were most likely put to death or really, really punished by almost being part of a secret society. Or, but that could mean like a lot of different things. So like witches and
Yeah,
covens, or even if you think about like my great grandfather who was in Latvia was in an anti-communist organization and then was sent to labor camps, right? And I don't know,
yeah.
it's going to be interesting. I can go look where his wound is, but if you think about, you know, souls reincarnated like that, but basically you're here to be witchy and have a healing gift. So there's a lot of different definitions of witchy, but obviously I kind of geeked out about the eighth house, even though it's fine.
That is so fascinating.
Like,
Okay. Um, ninth house, higher education. Oh, we did talk about this. I was like, this sounds familiar. Your beliefs, higher education, travel, spiritual exploration. 10th house, career, public life, reputation, and
could
long-term
be
goals.
wounds might show up as feeling uncomfortable in the public eye, on the public stage.
Hmm.
Said a lot of people here like really called to could be good in like the hospice space or social workers, people that have their Chiron in the 10th house.
Interesting. Okay. 11th house, friendships, community, and more long-term aspiration. What else
I
in
mean,
11th house?
that seems
Is that
pretty
everything?
pretty self-explanatory here. The 12th house was interesting because you've got some definitions here. The way
Yeah.
I heard about it is like the house of dreams and potentially
Yeah.
karma or karmic past journeys of addictions, being in asylums. And she said that
Yeah.
because one of the hosts, her Chiron was in her 12th house, because it's also religion.
I think so. I've also heard the 12th house is like your hidden life, sorrows, like it is the unconscious. There's a lot in there. It
Yeah,
feels
so
like a really
she said
deep
that
one.
she used to, which of course she had no connection to this back then, but her family was deeply religious and she used to get physically sick every time she would go to church. And I'm not saying that everybody who has Chiron in their
Wow.
12th house, that that's how it would show up for them, but he was talking about it really is. You think like it Pisces, they associate 12th house with Pisces too, just like really deep,
Hmm.
ethereal, right? They and to her, that was her past lives and her wounds of like I'm finding my own path, and that's high level kind of
Hmm.
how it showed up. But
That's so fascinating. I just like I want to hear more about people's experiences in these and just how it relates because it just starts to conceptualize in such a different way. But so a few things to note. And I think this is really important part of the conversation. So Chiron itself takes 50 to 51 years to move through all the 12 zodiac signs. So we talked about how, in your natal chart, Chiron will land in a sign and in a house. And there's two different distinctions to that. And that's your natal chart. And so Chiron moves at sort of this irregular orbit. And so earlier when you said we all have all the signs, we have all of the placements, or we have all the signs in our chart, because that's the truth, right? The planets are moving and they're transiting through all the signs. So as they move through each sign, they're activating different areas of our life, different aspects of our life. And so it takes about 50 to 51 years. And we were just chatting a little bit about how, because of this transit, around 51, 52 years old is when you will experience your Chiron
yeah,
return. Is that what we're calling it? is what it's called, right? Chiron return, because that's how long it takes from the time you were born to then transit that 51 years through all the signs to come back to where it was in your original
Every
placement.
time I hear about a new return, I don't know why, right? We hear all about the Saturn return, right? That's most people hear about your Saturn return. And I just am
Yeah.
laughing at myself because, I'm like, there's a Neptune return, which is what I'm in. I think, Michelle, you're just
Yes,
starting it or you're very close to it. And then I
probably.
don't know why, when I'm like, there's a Chiron return, I'm like, no wonder. I don't know why I keep being so shocked that there's all of these returns, but it's also really
Yeah.
fascinating because Chiron at that age range, right? And the Neptune return very fall into that like midlife crises type. So if you think about these like wounds coming up and how that could
Yeah.
really change your path, your course, and all the things that
Totally. Yeah, well, okay, the thought that flashed up when you said midlife crisis was like the trope of like the midlife crisis, the guy, like the dad buying the sports car in his 50s, but also like what if they have Chiron in their second house of money and resource, right? Or what, we don't know, but I'm just saying hypothetically, it's really fascinating. And so Chiron will take about 50 to 51 years to go through all the zodiac signs. And as it moves through these different zodiac signs, of course, it's activating different things in your chart, depending on where it is. It's activating collective themes as well. And because got that irregular orbit, there's no exact time frame for how long it will stay in one sign. It could be anywhere from 4 to 8 years that it stays in a sign. So right now, Chiron has been in Aries, the sign of Aries, since 2019, and it's going to stay in Aries until 2027. And we're talking about this because these transits are happening, right? We have our natal chart, but then we have these collective transits. This planets, the comets, the planets are moving regardless of what we do. They're all moving. And so collectively, this could be bringing up themes associated with Aries on a collective level, so societal level of self-identity, of confidence, of the fear of assertiveness, all things associated with Aries. So, to just really, before we dive into the collective themes and the transit of Chiron and Aries, it's really important to just continue driving home that distinction. So, we have the collective transit and we have our natal chart placement. And so, collectively, these celestial bodies, like Chiron, like any of the planets, are moving through the zodiac and they affect everyone in the world, and whether we realize it or not. And so there are going to be these shared themes that we're all experiencing. And of course, as above, so below, as without, as within, so without, like we're experiencing collective themes, and then they're landing maybe in different ways for each of us individually. But then you have your natal chart placement. That's your birth chart. And this is where Chiron was at the time of your birth. And that is what we talked about so much of this episode, pointing to those personal challenges, your own personal individual wounding and your growth and your healing journey. But when you look at them together, they get to show you again that idea that things are happening collectively around us all the time. Things are happening in our own inner world and they can be connected. They can, oftentimes be influencing one another. And so, anything to add to that thought?
what comes up for me and just kind of feeling like what puts a nice bow on the Chiron for me is the sentiment of
Mhm.
as you age, your Chiron placement can contribute to your development as a wise leader who inspires others to follow your example. And so to me, it's about
Mhm.
one, yes, like Aries, that's a collective theme for everybody. So everybody will be feeling that, but also I think for my life journey is really thinking more on that ninth house and the Taurus placement. But ultimately, to reframe it, is that we get the privilege of diving into those wounds and the goal is to be the wise centaur Chiron at the end of the day who's making an impact positive.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Like the to not stay in our suffering and to tap into our real well of personal power to transmute all of that into something that is healing and supportive of ourselves, of everything that we touch in this lifetime, if you so choose. So, fascinating thing about the Chiron and Aries transit. So, as I mentioned, Chiron has been in Aries since 2019 to 2027. So, you could say any children born from 2019 to 2027 will have Chiron in Aries. Now, it's going to land in a different area of their life because it's going to land differently on their houses based on their own personal birth print blueprint, but they're all going to have similar themes, Aries like themes. And you could also say that anyone born 50, 51 years ago, when Chiron was in Aries before, is now experiencing their Chiron return during this time. And so, talk about collective or societal themes. What is Aries, right? So, this could be wounds around self worth. So people might be grappling with feelings of inadequacy or doubt in their ability to assert themselves. And I bolded this one to
Mm-hmm.
take up space because that's such a big theme. I mean, think about just the boom of the coaching industry and what at its core, no matter what surface level things we're dealing with, many, I won't say all, but many themes come back to self-worth, being seen, taking up space, right? So that's a big theme and really interesting. Leadership hesitation, another theme of Chiron and Aries right now, or people experiencing maybe their Chiron return or experiencing this on a collective level, seeing this play out. So like a fear of stepping into leadership roles because of imposter syndrome, cultural expectations, fear of judgment, which leads to reluctance to express our individuality. And
Really like I'm hearing like just like a lot of self-worth issues. And I liked this one,
yeah.
like not being able to start their own fire or be their own cheerleader. It, these people really, it's
Hmm.
that confidence. So we could all be dealing with that, but then I think what you were
Yeah.
highlighting is specifically people born now and then 50, 15 years ago. So confidence issues.
Yeah.
I also said like possibly uncontrolled rage, but you think about like the Aries, the fire sign, it's the
Yes.
first of the zodiac. So I don't
Yeah.
mean to be like young and you're acting like children,
Well,
but you almost think like, where does uncontrolled, like it's when you're a younger soul, right?
yep.
And we can have uncontrolled rage as adults, but
Yeah.
in a wound sense, that makes a
Yeah.
sense. Mhm.
Acting out, acting rashly, right? Well, here's the other theme, healing the warrior archetype, because Aries, the god of war, Mars, is the planet that rules Aries, right? The god of war. And we have and I think this shows up a lot just societally right now in the world, and is this rush to assert dominance, to be aggressive in the way that we approach discourse. And I think, we've talked about this like in so many different aspects, but again, we're in an election year, and how have we seen just in the last few years so much? And we have the internet, you have in the comments section, people are like rushing to be on the
Yeah.
defense and on the attack.
Hmm.
It's two different things, but both. Instead of, and so when we talk about Aries qualities and this wound and this collective theme, it's like the warrior archetype, what you were saying about rage and rushing to action instead of true, like what's the higher frequency of that Aries warrior archetype and leadership qualities? It's being able to have like radical honesty, strong leadership, and accepting people using, like tapping into people's, like to me, a great leader can see people's strengths, can see opportunities, cannot get lost in personalizing everything, and can really help you navigate how we all fit together, how there's room for all of us, even though we may not agree, like healthy disagreement. And and so I see that so much like what is this like um nuance, and having the ability to have a supportive environment where everyone feels empowered to be able to express themselves without
Hmm.
resorting to aggression. So I think like it's so relevant when you think about just
Yeah,
2019 to 2027. It's playing out in so many different ways. But then on the flip side, of this, right? Because we're not all wallowing in our challenges and frustrations all the time, we see this growing emphasis on self-expression, on personal power, and particularly in these
yeah.
marginalized groups or just people maybe maybe because of the age that I'm at, but I don't know that in my lifetime I have seen so much advocacy and so many people expressing themselves online. And I'm not saying that it's right
It's
or
just
wrong or how
facts.
everyone does it
Yeah,
is right, but I do see
yeah.
it more. It just is, yeah. And it's people reclaiming their voices, whether it's for the
I don't think we
collective.
could throw so many
Yeah,
examples out there, but
yeah.
we don't need to judge. But it's the point that you're seeing
So
so many
many.
people feeling it's like that fire energy, right? I want to be careful of what words I want to use
Yes.
because I don't
Yeah.
want to demean anyone's passion around the things they're voicing. But I just, as a collective, you can see
No, but yeah,
a
yeah.
lot more people feeling called to get behind and instantly just having a reaction to something and
Yeah.
going for it, right? In their defense or whatever.
100%. Yeah. Well, and also in so many ways, it is like, again, like you're advocating for people, you're supporting, like if we're talking about the wounded healer and these things are being activated in different areas of your chart, whether or not you have Chiron and Aries or not, we're still all experiencing these themes in some way, maybe lighter, less or more than others, just depends on where it lights up in your chart or what's activated. But what I love is that higher frequency of Aries is like feeling empowered, finding your voice, tapping into your own level of personal power, and doing it in a way that has integrity. Like we said, like not from aggression, but from like collective care, compassion, caring for people. This again, back to like the Aquarian age of like taking care of one another, community based, and then the other theme was about conversations on self-acceptance. So this rise in conversations around self-acceptance, mental health, and identity, and they're super, super important because they're both healing but they're also validating your lived experience. And we're seeing that more and more again, like back to the rise and the boom in the wellness and coaching space, because more and more people are realizing, like, actually, I do need help in connecting to my truth, to my voice, in my self identity. And I think that's such an awesome thing to bear witness to. So this current transit of Chiron and Aries is really it's urging us to heal our sense of identity. It's urging us to take bold and aligned action and also to just be really compassionate and kind with ourselves when we're dealing with feelings
Just
of self-doubt. Is it Karmic Mirror podcast? Okay, so I think we've talked about everything I feel confident and feel knowledgeable about when it comes to Chiron, or at least deepened our own learning about Chiron in our natal chart, Chiron as a collective theme be due to the transit of where Chiron is now in Aries. So as always, we want to make sure we leave off with some just like real practical everyday thoughts. And so when we're talking about how to integrate the wisdom of Chiron, it starts with self-awareness. Everything is about self-awareness. That's why we have these beautiful tools to look up your natal chart and know where it lands for you so that you can just become more aware. And if that's all you do is learn where it lands, what that might mean for you, and you get to reflect on it, that is
mm,
also more than enough
yeah.
because so much will come from it. And you can reflect in all the ways, journal, meditate, go for a walk, whatever it is. What else?
So I think that the thing that's interesting when we talk about self-awareness, and one of the big themes on the Karmic Mirror we always talk about is to understand ourselves better helps us to understand others better. And we talked about the placement of Chiron. And so we do have a chart linked in the show notes that will give the time frames where if you don't happen to know the time, the exact time of your birth or location of your birth, and so you can't get your natal chart, you can see because of the timing of what happens with Chiron, you should be able to pull your placements. And so I bring that up when we're talking about self-awareness because, man, when I found that out, I didn't realize that, again, astrology 101 are here. It made me start to think about, oh my gosh, a lot of my good friends and one of my sisters falls in that same
Yeah.
area. And just starting to think about, well, it doesn't mean it shows up exactly for me, but we did come into this lifetime with the same sign of Chiron. So helping me just identify that.
Yeah.
One kind of tidbit that I heard that was really interesting and I think is quite lovely is that one of the astrologers, when talking about Chiron, said that she really likes to work with her moon energy because with people struggling with their Chiron, because the moon gives us a lot of info on how we can feel safe. So I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but I thought that that was something really beautiful to highlight and something I'm going to look into deeper.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it just lends itself to what you're saying about, knowing yourself better. And I think when you start to, when you start on this kind of like path of self-discovery, the more you can, at least in my experience, you can have more compassion for yourself and for the things that you maybe judged yourself or felt guilt for in the past. And I find it's very difficult to sit with my own stories and not judge myself and then turn around and judge other people. So I think, I don't know if that ties to vulnerability at all, but I do think that if we're really being honest, right? Like it starts to help us look at people with that compassion. And so I think the tip here was about just having these conversations with people, like having real with people that feel trusted, that you can kind of explore like we do, right? Like we get to talk about all these things and there's no shame around like what you do or don't know. And just like realizing, just how everything is so connected and how, again, like bringing it back to like preschool, but you're pointing the finger at someone else, we're really pointing it at ourselves. Um, and so yeah, so practical wise, honestly, like as always, we really do subscribe to the meditations, to the journaling, to the doing the things that counteract whatever it is. Like if mine is around creative expression, like that's pointing to go do something that puts you in your creative power and don't worry about the expectation. Do the thing for yourself, for your own enjoyment, and let that be enough. And I think we can start to look at where Chiron lands for you and find those things that you're like, oh, I want to do this thing, but I shouldn't. That's your signal, like go do the thing. Let it start to crack open the healing a little bit. So all of that to say that Chiron is our teacher, it's our mentor. It's teaching us through the mythology, through our own experiences to really um embrace our wounds. And if embracing feels like too intense, you're like, Michelle, there is no way. Embrace my wounds, get out of here. Like maybe it's to observe, to reflect on them, and then start to remove some of the judgment and the sting. And when we do that, we can stop identifying with our wounds and stop making it our story of who we are because it's not. And we can start to transform these wounding, these experiences that are tender and are painful, and transform them into tools, into self acceptance, into growth, into whatever it is that you're being called to heal, and in whatever way that is. Only you can really be the one to decide that. And so, what else before we close out with our
Let's get to our self-love check-in. So today we're landing on a place of where, Michelle, can you learn from your healing journey and how can it help you grow and support others?
I just keep learning over and over through these outlets, through the podcast, through my newsletter, through blogging. Um, just it's again like going back to that quote of like every step forward sets you free. And it's like every time I hit publish on something and I let those fears and those feelings of whatever stories, you sound stupid or you sound like you don't know what you're, or whatever it is, or imposter syndrome, the more I do it and then I let those feelings come up and don't let them dictate, like feel the fear and do it anyways, like I continue to move forward, it just makes me a better human, first of all, because I'm not so wrapped up in my own shit that I can't be there and hold space for people. It also makes me a better coach in so many ways because again, like you can only go as deep as you've gone into your own depths. And so if you stay at these surface levels, that's okay. Maybe that's your karmic experiences in this lifetime, and that's cool too. But the deeper you go, the deeper I can hold space, the deeper I can go with other people. And that's so much a part of what I want to experience in this lifetime. What about you? What are you learning, or what can you learn from your healing journey, and how is it helping
I
you?
mean, that the list, the ever growing list just keeps on growing and keeps going. And we chuckle a little bit, but I think in all seriousness, that is that is the life people like you and I think have signed up for. It's just we can't unsee it. And so,
Mhm.
I think for me, it's
Mhm.
about yes, like even during these conversations, Michelle, just so much more it like clicks and it's like aha, and it makes sense. And so I think a
Yep.
couple of things, like just being honest in the healing journey, there's a lot of things, but just kind of sometimes surrendering. People will say, like, oh, you really got to heal this. I'm like, great, just add it to the list. Like, I already know these things. And so I think a little bit is when I start to hear about these different areas in my chart from like a healing perspective, the big aha is just I've already even seen like the overwhelm and the stories I can tell myself. And I think the journey for me has been to just take time and get clear on what's the inner opponent, be in community with people who can help you in a loving way, kind of talk through those things because
Mhm.
even if you just look, for example, in the ninth house, right? That is, it represents so many different things. And even just as you were talking, I'm like, oh, it's about your belief systems. But that, think how broad belief systems can be. So just
Right.
giving
Yeah.
ourselves grace. And I think that's how you really support me and how we can support others. And I think by you and I just being vulnerable and sharing our truth with the Karmic Mirror audience is just another way that we are healing
Yes.
because we're putting our shit out there. And albeit maybe not all of our shit all the time,
Mhm.
but we are putting it out there. And that helps us, just like my travel story earlier, right? I didn't even know that that's something in my Chiron experience that I'd kind of already overcome or,
Yeah.
brought into the light is maybe a more beautiful way to say it. And now I've identified some more. So let's see where this journey takes me as I, lean into healing some of these other areas that show up in my Chiron placement.
Yeah, I love that. How very Virgo of you. I always have the visual of like, cartoons, like there's that long scroll and you roll it and it just keeps going and going. And that was the visual. I mean, I don't think that about you, but I was just, that's where my mind goes, is like a weird visual.
It's in my mental brain. It's literally probably there. I'm like, okay, check, belief systems, right?
Yeah. Well, and also these are, I would imagine a lot of the people who are out there doing service work or healing work or call themselves healers who maybe do have those more Virgo-like qualities, perhaps, who are here to like create systems for the people who are like, yeah, I need to know. I want to check it off. Like, and maybe I do need to intellectualize it first and feel really solid and stable in that so that I can feel safe to like go deeper. I don't know.
Yeah,
But this was really awesome. I can't wait to listen to it back
I know. I was,
and deepen the healing of hearing yourself
I
back.
know.
The cringe. No, I'm
It
kidding.
really
I
does.
think we're getting past it.
I was telling Michelle that it's in all seriousness, we obviously are having the conversation, so there's real live ahas. I edit, so I get another chance to listen to what we've had to say today, and it's always so interesting to me that when they come out, it's not like I edited today and it comes out tomorrow, but
Mhm.
listening to our episodes, I think it's just like a really cool journey. And selfishly, I continue to have more ahas. So I'm sure when we listen back, we will have even more ahas and be able to talk more about our experiences and this healing journey with Chiron.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and send us a note if you want to talk more. We want to geek out with our audience. We want to get in the DMs with you or email or whatever and just hear more real time ahas, real life experiences. So thanks everyone.
Thanks for tuning in. If you resonate with today's conversation, connect with us on Instagram at Karmic Mirror Podcast and send us a message.
And don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen. And if you're loving Karmic Mirror, we'd appreciate a glowing review or a share with someone who could benefit.
As we close, remember, life is not a one-size-fits-all approach. How are you honoring your unique path? Stay curious and always be kind to yourself. Until next time on Karmic Mirror.